There is a version of World War II that most Americans know by heart. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, and industrial might. A story where democracy stood against tyranny, where factories outproduced fascism, and where an alliance saved civilization itself. All of that is true. But history, when examined closely, often carries a second story. One that unfolds not on battlefields, but in balance sheets, contracts, and quiet negotiations far from the sound of bombs. This is that story. Not a story of betrayal, not a story of villains, but a story of power, how it is exercised, preserved, and transferred during moments of existential crisis. Because while World War II was fought with tanks and aircraft, another war was being fought simultaneously, a financial war, and its outcome reshaped the global order more permanently than any military victory. To understand it, we need to begin with a moment of absolute vulnerability. In December 1940, Britain was not losing the war, but it was running out of something far more essential than courage: money. On December 8, 1940, Winston Churchill wrote what may have been the most consequential letter of his political life. It was addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it was not a declaration of strength. It was an admission of insolvency. Britain was not struggling financially. It was bankrupt. 7 months into the war, the British Treasury had exhausted its reserves. Gold was gone. Dollar balances were gone. Overseas assets were being liquidated at a pace no empire had ever experienced. This fact alone should pause us. Before the war, Britain was the wealthiest nation on earth. The British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface. British citizens owned vast overseas investments: railways in South America, mines in Africa, oil in the Middle East, plantations in Asia. London was the financial center of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. And yet, in less than a year of modern industrial war, all of that financial dominance had evaporated. Not because Britain was defeated, but because Britain was paying cash. When war broke out in 1939, the United States was officially neutral. The American public had no appetite for another European war. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts precisely to prevent entanglement. Those laws contained a single clause that would prove decisive: cash and carry. Belligerent nations could purchase American weapons and supplies, but only if they paid cash up front and transported the goods themselves. No credit, no loans, no exceptions. For Britain, this was catastrophic. The empire needed American steel, oil, aircraft, munitions, food. American industry was the only source capable of meeting those demands at scale. So Britain paid, in gold, in dollars, in assets accumulated over centuries. In the summer of 1940, as German bombers attacked British cities nightly, the British government launched Operation Fish, the largest transfer of physical wealth in human history. Britain loaded its entire national gold reserve onto warships and civilian liners and sent it across a U-boat-infested Atlantic to vaults in North America. By late 1940, the gold was gone. Yet the war was only beginning. By November, the British Purchasing Commission in Washington sent a stark message back to London. There were no dollars left. Contracts for aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and food were still being signed, but there was no money to pay for them. This is the moment where the popular mythology begins. The story usually told is simple and comforting. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but domestic politics constrained him. So he created Lend-Lease, a generous program to supply allies with what they needed to defeat fascism. He famously explained it with a metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him your garden hose. You lend it to him and get it back when the fire's out. It is a beautiful image. It is also deeply misleading. Because Lend-Lease was not designed in a vacuum. It was negotiated meticulously. by the United States Treasury. And the man overseeing those negotiations was not a sentimental idealist. It was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., Secretary of the Treasury and one of the most powerful figures in the Roosevelt administration. Morgenthau understood something fundamental. Britain was not merely fighting Germany. Britain was liquidating itself to survive, and Morgenthau intended to ensure that liquidation was complete. Before a single dollar of Lend-Lease aid was approved, the Treasury demanded something extraordinary. A full financial disclosure, not just of government assets, but of private British assets around the world, every company, every investment, every security held by British citizens in the United States. The logic was blunt. If Britain still possessed wealth, why should American taxpayers subsidize the war? Liquidate first. Then we talk. To British officials, this was shocking. Britain was under daily bombardment. The Battle of the Atlantic threatened starvation. The nation's survival hung by a thread. And yet the condition for aid was financial exposure to a foreign power. The British negotiators protested. They warned that selling long-term investments under duress would lead to fire sale prices. They argued that stripping overseas income would cripple post-war recovery. Morgenthau was unmoved. Congress, he argued, would never approve aid unless Britain proved it was truly destitute. Proof would require sacrifice. That sacrifice soon came. Among the most valuable British-owned assets in America was the American Viscose Corporation, the largest producer of rayon and synthetic silk in the United States. It was owned by Courtaulds, a British company. American Viscose generated millions in annual profits that flowed back to Britain, precisely the kind of income stream a nation at war desperately needed. Morgenthau demanded its sale. Immediately, the British government resisted. Selling such an asset under coercion would be disastrous. The response was an ultimatum. Sell, or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. In March 1941, the British government seized American Viscose under emergency war powers and forced its sale. The buyers knew Britain had no leverage. The price reflected that. American Viscose, worth over $100 million, sold for roughly half that. The proceeds went straight to the U.S. Treasury. This was not aid, it was foreclosure, and it was only the beginning. Over the following months, Britain was compelled to liquidate hundreds of millions of dollars in American securities. Stocks, bonds, and investments accumulated over generations. By mid-1941, Britain had sold over $1 billion in American assets. Only then did Lend-Lease funds begin to flow. Even before Lend-Lease, another transaction revealed the true balance of power. In September 1940, Britain desperately needed naval vessels to counter German U-boats. Roosevelt agreed to provide 50 aging destroyers, ships the U.S. Navy considered obsolete. In exchange, Britain granted the United States 99-year leases on strategic military bases across the Atlantic and Caribbean. From Newfoundland to the Bahamas, from Jamaica to British Guiana. The deal reshaped hemispheric security permanently. The United States acquired strategic dominance over the Atlantic without firing a shot. Britain gave it away, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. By the time Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, the transformation was already underway. Britain would receive supplies, but at the cost of its financial independence, and buried within the agreement was a clause whose implications would not fully emerge until after victory. Article 7. It required Britain to dismantle imperial trade preferences after the war. In simple terms, it meant this. The British Empire could no longer protect its own markets. American companies would have equal access and superior efficiency. The war would be fought with American weapons. The peace would be fought with American capital. And the consequences would last far longer than the conflict itself. In the next part, We will follow this process through the war years and into the moment when victory finally arrived, only for the financial reckoning to begin. By the time the United States formally entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the financial relationship between the two allies had already been fundamentally reshaped. The battlefield alliance was solidifying. The financial hierarchy was already decided. From the American perspective, Lend-Lease was framed as an act of enlightened self-interest. The United States would supply the material means of war, mobilize its unmatched industrial capacity, and ensure that the Axis powers were defeated without draining American blood prematurely. This framing was not false, but it was incomplete. Because while American factories were producing weapons, ships, aircraft, and food on an unprecedented scale, American institutions were also restructuring the post-war world. Deliberately, methodically, and with remarkable foresight. Lend-Lease was never simply about survival. It was about succession. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States supplied its allies with over $50 billion worth of goods, an astronomical sum for the era. Britain was the largest recipient. On paper, much of this aid appeared generous, even altruistic. In practice, it came with constraints that would shape the future of global finance. The key illusion lay in the word lend. Very little was ever intended to be returned, but much was intended to be repaid. The repayment would not come in tanks or aircraft. It would come in influence. During the war, Britain's economy became increasingly dependent on American supply chains. Food imports, oil, industrial inputs, all flowed from across the Atlantic. This dependence was not accidental. It reflected a structural shift. Before the war, Britain had been a creditor nation. It earned income from overseas investments and used that income to sustain its balance of payments. By 1942, that model was gone. The sale of overseas assets had stripped Britain of its financial cushion. Lend-Lease replaced income with supply, but supply could not be reinvested. It could only be consumed. This distinction is crucial. Consumption sustains survival. Investment sustains power. The war forced Britain into a position where survival was possible, but recovery would be constrained. American policymakers understood this perfectly. In internal Treasury memoranda, officials openly discussed the opportunity presented by Britain's financial exhaustion. The concern was not whether Britain would survive the war, it was what kind of power it would be afterward. By 1943, planning for the post-war order was already underway. At Bretton Woods in the summer of 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered to design a new international financial system. The conference is often remembered as a triumph of cooperation, and in many ways, it was. But cooperation does not imply equality. The United States arrived at Bretton Woods with two overwhelming advantages. First, it held the majority of the world's gold reserves, roughly 3/4 of the total. Second, it was the only major industrial power whose homeland had not been devastated by war. Factories were intact, infrastructure was untouched, capital was abundant. Britain arrived with prestige, experience, and intellectual tradition, but without leverage. Its gold was gone, its reserves depleted, its economy stretched thin. The negotiations reflected this imbalance. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, proposed an ambitious system designed to prevent persistent trade imbalances. His vision was elegant, sophisticated, and deeply informed by the failures of the interwar period. But it conflicted with American interests. The United States did not want a system that constrained surplus countries. It wanted one that institutionalized its position as the world's primary creditor. The result was a compromise that favored American preferences. The dollar became the anchor of the global system. Currencies were pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created. Institutions designed to stabilize global finance, but also to reflect the power structure of their principal contributor. This was not exploitation, it was strategy, and it was enabled by the financial exhaustion of an ally. Britain accepted the system because it had no viable alternative. The war had been won, but the empire's financial independence had not survived it. The consequences became clear almost immediately. In 1945, Lend-Lease was abruptly terminated. Not gradually, not negotiated, abruptly. Within days of Japan's surrender, American shipments ceased. Britain faced an immediate balance of payments crisis. Factories that depended on American inputs stalled. Food imports were threatened. Rationing, already severe during the war, continued for years afterward. The justification was procedural. The war was over. The program had served its purpose. But for Britain, the timing was devastating. In 1946, Britain was forced to seek an American loan to avoid economic collapse. The terms were harsh. A loan of $3.75 billion at interest. A requirement to make the pound convertible to dollars. An obligation to dismantle imperial trade preferences. Convertibility proved disastrous. Within weeks, Britain hemorrhaged dollars as pent-up demand drained reserves. The experiment was suspended, but the damage was done. Sterling never fully recovered its pre-war status. The empire began to unwind. Colonies gained independence, driven by political forces. Yes, but accelerated by financial reality. Without reserve currency status, without overseas income, without protected markets, the imperial model was unsustainable. Meanwhile, the United States entered what would later be called its golden age. The dollar reigned supreme. American capital flowed outward. American corporations expanded globally. The very system that constrained Britain empowered America. Again, this was not malevolence, it was structure. War had created a vacuum. Finance filled it. This is the uncomfortable truth rarely addressed in popular narratives. World War II did not simply defeat fascism, it completed a transfer of global financial leadership. Not through conquest, not through coercion, but through conditional assistance at a moment of existential vulnerability. The alliance was real. The gratitude was genuine. The consequences were permanent. Understanding this does not diminish American achievement. It contextualizes it. Power is not immoral, but it is never accidental. In the next part, we will confront the most controversial question of all. Was this outcome inevitable? Or could a different financial settlement have preserved alliance without succession? To answer that, we must look not at intentions, but at incentives. To ask whether the post-war outcome could have been different is to confront one of history's most uncomfortable realities. History is not shaped by what leaders want. It is shaped by what systems reward. Franklin Roosevelt did not wake up intending to dismantle another empire. American officials did not sit in rooms plotting decline. British leaders did not surrender influence willingly. And yet the outcome followed a logic that none of them could escape. The reason lies in incentives. War distorts incentives more profoundly than any other human activity. It compresses time, amplifies risk, and elevates survival above every other consideration. In such conditions, long-term equilibrium becomes secondary. Short-term necessity dominates. For Britain, the incentive was simple and brutal. Survive the war. For the United States, the incentive was more complex and more powerful. It was to shape the peace. By 1941, American policymakers had absorbed the lessons of World War I. They believed, correctly, that the failure to stabilize global finance after 1918 had contributed directly to the Great Depression and the rise of extremism. This belief was sincere, but sincerity does not negate self-interest. The United States emerged from the interwar period with a clear conclusion: Global stability required American leadership, financial, monetary, and institutional. Leadership, however, requires leverage. Lend-Lease provided it. The genius of the program was not merely that it supplied material aid. It restructured dependency. Britain no longer financed its own war effort through income and reserves. It relied on flows controlled elsewhere. Once that shift occurred, the balance of power was no longer symmetrical, even among allies. This is where inevitability enters the story. Any nation that supplies another with the majority of its food, fuel, and industrial inputs during total war acquires influence over its future. This is not ideology. It is logistics. The United States could not have supplied Britain at scale without transforming the relationship. Nor could Britain have resisted without risking defeat. The asymmetry was baked in. Critics sometimes argue that America could have offered unconditional aid. No asset liquidation, no trade concessions, no post-war restructuring. In theory, yes. In reality, no. American domestic politics made that impossible. Congress was deeply skeptical of foreign entanglements. The memory of unpaid World War I debts remained vivid. There was widespread resentment that European powers had defaulted on obligations while America suffered economic turmoil. Any program perceived as a gift to preserve imperial privilege would have failed politically. The Roosevelt administration understood this. Lend-Lease had to be framed and structured as temporary, conditional, and ultimately beneficial to the American public. That framing required Britain to appear exhausted, not entrenched, hence the insistence on asset liquidation, hence the dismantling of preferential trade systems, hence the emphasis on a post-war order based on open markets. These were not punitive measures. They were legitimizing ones. They made American leadership acceptable at home. Now consider Bretton Woods again, not as a conference of ideals, but as a convergence of incentives. The United States wanted a system that would ensure global demand for the dollar, prevent competitive devaluations, institutionalize its creditor position. Britain wanted a system that would allow flexibility, protect domestic recovery, preserve some autonomy over trade. These goals were incompatible. The nation with reserves dictates the rules. This has always been true. Gold flows confer authority. Britain no longer had them. The outcome was therefore predetermined, regardless of personalities. Keynes' proposals were intellectually superior in many respects. Even American officials privately admired them. But admiration does not outweigh advantage. The system that emerged reflected power realities, not philosophical elegance. This is not unique to that moment. Every international financial system in history has mirrored the distribution of reserves at its inception. What makes the post-war settlement distinctive is that it occurred among allies, without coercion, without conquest, without formal domination. And yet the result was indistinguishable from succession. The most revealing evidence of inevitability lies in what happened afterward. Despite the financial strain, Britain accepted the system. It joined the IMF. It implemented convertibility. It dismantled trade preferences, even when the consequences were painful. Why? Because rejecting the system would have meant isolation, and isolation in a world rebuilding after total war was not survivable. The same logic applied to others. Western Europe accepted American financial leadership in exchange for reconstruction. Japan did the same. The Marshall Plan followed a similar pattern, generosity paired with structural alignment. Again, this was not exploitation. It was conditional integration. Those who accepted gained access to capital and markets. Those who resisted were left behind. This model worked remarkably well. Global growth accelerated, trade expanded. stability improved. From an American perspective, the system was a triumph, and in many ways it was. But triumph has a cost, even for the victor. Because systems built on dominance must eventually confront their own success. The very mechanisms that elevated the United States also encouraged dependence. Dependence, over time, breeds resentment. Not moral resentment, but strategic. Nations begin to ask whether reliance is prudent. That question echoes forward into the present. The financial weaponization discussed earlier, the freezing of reserves, the exclusion from systems, is not a break from the post-war order. It is its extension. The logic is identical. Control of infrastructure enables leverage. Leverage enables influence. Influence tempts assertion. What changed after World War II is not the nature of power, but its visibility. The transition from British to American financial leadership was gradual, institutional, and largely uncontested. Today's transitions are faster, more transparent, and more widely scrutinized. Technology compresses time. Alternatives emerge sooner. This is why the post-war transfer matters so deeply. It established the template. It showed how financial leadership could change hands without war. And it demonstrated that even allies can be transformed by structural necessity. The uncomfortable implication is this: if it happened once, it can happen again. Not tomorrow, not suddenly, but incrementally. In the final part, we will step back and ask the question that lingers beneath every great historical shift. What does this story ultimately tell us about power itself? And what should an informed audience take from it? Not as accusation, but as understanding. Every generation inherits a story about power. Some inherit it as triumph, others as tragedy. Most inherit it as inevitability. What makes the story of Lend-Lease so enduring is not that it reveals betrayal or benevolence, but that it exposes something far more uncomfortable. Power rarely changes hands because someone planned for it to. It changes hands because circumstances made every other outcome impossible. The financial transformation that unfolded during and after World War II was not the result of a conspiracy, nor of moral failure. It was the consequence of asymmetry under pressure. One nation fought for survival. Another prepared for stewardship. Both acted rationally. And yet rational actions, when taken within unequal systems, produce unequal outcomes. This is the lesson that echoes far beyond the 1940s. Wars do not merely destroy cities. They reorder hierarchies. And the most durable hierarchies are not enforced with armies, but with institutions. When the war ended, the world stood exhausted. Europe lay in ruins. Asia was shattered. Old empires were hollowed out. Politically, economically, psychologically. One nation stood apart. Its factories were intact, its reserves abundant, its institutions confident. This asymmetry was not created by malice. It was created by geography, timing, and restraint. But asymmetry invites responsibility, and responsibility invites design. The post-war financial system was designed not merely to prevent collapse, but to prevent a return to the instability of the interwar years. In that sense, it succeeded. The dollar became the world's anchor. Global trade expanded, capital flowed, living standards rose. From the perspective of outcomes, the system worked. But systems that work well often conceal their trade-offs. The price of stability was concentration. The price of efficiency was dependence. The price of leadership was expectation. For decades, these trade-offs were invisible, even to those who benefited most. The United States could finance deficits without immediate consequence. It could project power without balancing accounts. It could shape institutions while appearing neutral. This was not exploitation. It was privilege. And privilege, once normalized, becomes assumed. The story of Lend-Lease matters because it reveals how such privilege is born, not through domination, but through assistance under conditions of necessity. The ally who supplies becomes indispensable. The indispensable becomes central. The central becomes structural. And structure outlives intent. No one in 1941 could have predicted the precise contours of the modern financial order, but the direction was already set. Once the pound ceased to anchor global trade, something else would. Once overseas income streams were liquidated, something else would replace them. Once imperial preference was dismantled, something else would fill the vacuum. The dollar did not conquer the world, it was invited, because nothing else could perform the role. That distinction matters. It reminds us that power is often less aggressive than it appears, and more fragile than it feels. Because systems built on trust must constantly justify themselves. The moment they are perceived as instruments rather than frameworks, trust begins to thin. History shows that this thinning is rarely dramatic. It is procedural. Small adjustments, incremental hedges, quiet diversification. And then, suddenly, what once seemed permanent feels negotiable. The transition from British to American financial leadership was not a collapse. It was a glide. So gradual that most participants did not recognize it until it was complete. This is why it remains such a valuable case study. Not because it condemns anyone, but because it instructs everyone. It teaches us that alliances are real, but interests are structural. That generosity and leverage can coexist. That helping someone survive may still reshape who they become afterward. And it teaches us something else. Something profoundly relevant today. That financial power, once established, is tempting to use. And once used coercively, it invites the same logic that once elevated it to work in reverse. The mechanisms that replaced one system can replace another, not because history repeats mechanically, but because incentives remain constant. Control of infrastructure confers influence. Influence invites assertion. Assertion erodes neutrality. Eroded neutrality accelerates alternatives. This cycle does not judge. It simply unfolds. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires maturity. It allows us to see World War II not only as a moral struggle, which it undeniably was, but as a structural pivot in global power. It allows us to appreciate American leadership without mythologizing it. And it allows us to recognize that no system, however successful, remains immune to the dynamics that created it. If you have followed this entire analysis, you have engaged with history at a level few do. Not as celebration, not as accusation, but as structure. That kind of engagement matters. It sharpens judgment. It deepens perspective. It replaces slogans with understanding. If this exploration added clarity, if it gave you a framework you can carry into other debates about power, money, and global order, then it has already done its work. A thoughtful response tells the algorithm that long-form reasoning still has a place. A quiet endorsement helps this reach others who value depth over outrage. And if there is one person you respect enough to disagree with, someone whose mind you trust even when conclusions differ, sharing this conversation may be more valuable than agreement itself. That is how serious ideas endure, not by force, but by being worth thinking about.